everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. I'm really happy to be joined today by Nona, Atticus, Glenn, and Andrea. They're going to talk to us about sexual well-being. They represent a couple different organizations, so I'll probably just let you guys do your own introductions, because it would be a lot for me to memorize on one of the last days before my vacation. Before we get started into anything else, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle in this conversation today. So before we jump into the meat of the conversation, specifically for today, the topics we cover can sometimes be triggering. They can be sensitive or overwhelming. If that's you for today, if you know that's you going into this, please make sure that you're engaging in some self-care. Have an elder, friend, counselor, family member, whatever support system you need around you, please make sure that you're engaging in that for today. So my name is Cole. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, and I'll be facilitating the session today. Other Learning Circle team members in the room but off camera are Kaylin, our program assistant, and for today, our production coordinator, our acting production coordinator. So yay for Kaylin. So with that, I think I'll just turn the mic over to you guys, whoever wants to start. Maybe start with some introductions, maybe. Atticus, do you mind if I put you?
Yeah. Tansei Kasiga-san, Atticus Cornarelli. I am Anishinaabe from so-called Treaty 8 territory, which is now called Northern Alberta, and Nehio from Treaty 6 territory, which is now called Southern Saskatchewan. And what else did I say?
Maybe the organization.
Oh, yeah. I am the Two-Spirit educator for Yuusnewas, which we do most of our work with YouthCO. So we are a youth-driven peer support education for youth around HIV, Hep C, sexual health, and harm reduction. And my job is to make sure that the work we do, especially with Yuusnewas, is more gender-affirming and inclusive with the workshops and the language and the representation within our organization.
My name's Nona Marchand. I'm from the Digital First Nations located on Vancouver Island, as well as from the Okanagan Indian Band on my dad's side. I work with YouthCO as well, with Yuusnewas as their educator, and we kind of have a focus on harm reduction and sexual well-being. And my job is basically, as one of the educators, to go into different communities throughout BC and give workshops related to HIV, harm reduction, decolonizing our health, and sexual well-being.
Cool.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Medley, Joth, Kagana, Hinu Dikyung. My Haida name is Storymaid, given to me by my Nani. I'm from the Dowdens, Yakajonas, Raven Clan, and I grew up in Old Mass Haida Gwaii, and I've been a visitor here on the unceded-occupied Coast Salish territories for 11 years. I work with First Nations Health Authority as the Indigenous Wellness educator, one of the educators on the Indigenous Wellness team, and so in my role, we do community education around sexual well-being, as well as some of the staff on our team are kind of cover some of the more clinical aspects around sexual well-being, and so we kind of work together to support community conversations and community access to sexual well-being resources and information. And also, just to note that a couple folks were invited but send the regrets. So Emily Solos from the BC Center for Disease Control is their Indigenous nurse educator, Chimamuk, and the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, but hopefully they can make it next time.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Glenn Tazazi. I'm Dennis Hotlene from northern Manitoba. I was raised on my reserve until I was about 14. And I identify as a two-spirit and also a gay man. My experience around HIV and Hep C growing up on the reserve was really difficult because of the stigma and discrimination and misinformation about this topic. And so there was a lot of stigma on the reserve, that connected HIV with being gay. Mm-hmm. And that made me stay in the closet on the reserve until I moved to Vancouver. The stigma still exists where I come from. So when I go back is on the reserve where I'm from. So it's so when I go back, I don't really share about my sexuality over there because there's still a lot of stigma. So, and I not currently work at the Community-Based Research Center, also known as the CBRC. It's a national nonprofit organization that focuses on gay men's health. We are inclusive of the bisexual and queer men, cis and trans and two-spirit people. Unlike our partners, we do not do frontline work. CBRC is more focused on research, intervention development, and policy change. We transform ideas into actions and make a difference in our communities.
Glenn, you're newer in your role, right?
I'm new. Oh yes,
Yeah.
I didn't mention that. I'm very new. Like 2 months.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us and for being here today. Okay, just checking the chat, but it looks like we're working and we're up and running. So the first kind of conversation starter that I wanted to introduce to everybody is it revolves around the title that we used for the session, which was sexual well-being as opposed to sexual health. So let's kind of start there. What are the differences between those two terms to you guys? Open, whoever would like to take a stab at it.
I can, but I don't want to. I kind of put forward that suggestion that we change the title
Mm-hmm.
to sexual being, so I can speak to that, but if anyone else has any pieces to add, I'd be happy to hear. But for me, I think just looking at the meanings of the words, so I think for me, sexual health kind of has these connotations around physical health, and I think we'll all speak to this throughout our session, but the emphasis of and the kind of legacies around looking at sexual health is purely like a physical matter than all the other pieces, and so I think well-being looks at the holistic nature of sexuality and sexual health. And so for me, I think looking at the many pieces that make up sexual being, to look at those pieces is important, such as healthy relationships, our identities, looking at traditional teachings and values and rites of passage around sexual well-being, as well as looking at ways that we can protect ourselves and the communities that we live in. And so for me, I think it broadens the topic of rather than just sexual health, and it looks at the many different pieces and factors that affect our ability to be well. And,
I think I would, pretty much agree with what Andrea said about kind of how I feel the difference would be. I think sexual health has like this idea of it just being biological and like bodily functions and everything like that. But I think sexual well-being, includes all of the different aspects, like the way it's connected to like our identities, our mental health, the way we think about it, and how that involves just our own being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think well-being too like goes beyond just health, and like sexual health is very medicalized, and it sounds very sterile. It doesn't, and it sounds like you have to go to a doctor to talk about your sexual stuff, but you don't. You can go do a lot of that stuff without a doctor. So yeah, it just doesn't. I think there's also a lot of shame connected to like the word sexual health too, because like the way it's taught in schools and also the stigma. So there's a lot more tied to it. So it's just like when we used to say safe spaces and now we say safer spaces because we're being more inclusive to like more complex intersections and stuff like that. So because well-being can bring health and whatnot, can bring all of it in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that, particularly that last part about kind of states and well-being being something you're working towards. Whereas, if you say health, it would indicate like healthy as being like a perfectly attainable and more importantly a definable thing for every single person, which is a really great point that I've never considered before. Thank you. my first follow-up question to that would be, so we're talking a lot about aspects outside of well-being. So in the context of your guys' work, I suppose, what are some examples of some of those aspects of your personhood, I suppose, or of yourself that are impacted by your sexual well-being outside of your physical or bodily functions? So are we talking like mental health, in which case, kind of where are those intersections, and how can we chat about that?
I think sexual well-being, especially like as a survivor of abuse and sexual abuse, it has a lot to do with my relationships and how I have a relationship with my body. Like I'm Indigenous, and I look Indigenous, and I navigate through the world as an Indigenous person, so I got a lot of like racially like white supremacy, like trying to be beautiful on the backdrop of white supremacy is really, 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 really hard, especially as a person who has brown skin, who is visibly Indigenous, and it's harder to love yourself. And I never really thought about sexual health or sexual well-being, like back when I didn't have a relationship with myself and my body. And like, I'm a bigger person too. I'm also like a fat person, and I'm already told like, and I think that has a lot to do with my sexual well-being, like unlearning fat phobia and diet culture, and also learning how to navigate romantic relationships after domestic violence and like stuff like that. Like it's so deeper than that, and I never used to put those things in with my sexual health or my sexual well-being because you're not taught those things. You know, like there's a lot of shame around talking about those things, and so just learning how to, I guess, talk about it and love myself and learn how to love other people, which is really, really, really hard, especially as an Indigenous youth in late capitalism. But yeah, so that's kind of a vague description of like how it affects other things in my life, because like it really does affect my relationships, especially romantic relationships, especially sexual relationships. Those are the ones that cause me a lot of like pain because of trauma that I've lived through. And now, you know, being a sexual health educator and like having those conversations more and normalizing them has really like, I love myself. I don't feel like I have to go on diets anymore. I don't feel like I have to be lighter skin tone. I don't feel like I have to, you know, present a certain way to be happy. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
I love what you said, because I think like the way you phrase the question and your response, Atticus, because that really speaks to the interconnectedness of it all. And I think as sexual health educators, you know, like it's like easy to kind of compartmentalize what we're teaching, like teach people to put on a condom. Like, okay, that's not like super easy, but it's relatively easier than like trying to explain all of these other like systemic issues that impact us and our abilities to be sexually well and to talk about it in ways that are more broad and real, like because all of these experiences affect the way that we experience our sexual well-being, the ways that we're able to speak and to teach about it. And I think especially as Indigenous people, we had those teachings and, you know, they've been interrupted. And I think thinking about the ways that we can reclaim them and support each other through that is, for me, a really important, like the key aspect of this work. Yeah, and I think like also back to the condom example, like teaching about like the nuts and bolts of putting a condom, but then I think in reality it's like, what are all the factors before that will lead someone to actually like using this information in a way that
or even be able to bring it up to their partners, because we don't talk about, like, being a youth myself, and like, you know, like 3 years ago was a time where I wasn't able to communicate, and like I already knew how to put on a condom, I already knew all that stuff, but I didn't know how to bring it up in the moment and be like, do you have a condom? It like scared me to even ask that question. So it's like, how do we build people's like knowledge, I guess, and confidence enough that they're able to ask something, can we use a condom even?
And I've seen your team's workshops, and I think you all do such an amazing job of that, of like giving those scenarios real life context and giving people like speaking what do you call it? Like speaking points.
Yeah, we like go a lot into like consent about, and also just like tips like with like assertive communication and being able to talk about that and opening up that conversation and breaking down like all of those stigmas that like will suppress you from being able to do those things.
Like a communications toolkit almost.
Yeah, and you have to be like open all the time though. Like I'm an open book, and it took me a long time to be like, right from the get-go, I like start communicating and being honest, because if you just even like give a little bit where you're not communicating and you're keeping what you really feel inside, it's easy to just fall into that too. So it's like we always need to talk about it. Like I love doing workshops because I get to tell all my stories and like my experience, and I love telling stories if anybody knows me. And especially like stories that you can't really like go to a meeting and tell like so
In terms of the you were one of the things that that I'm wanting to get people to do, like, is to take the Sex Now survey, like the center where I work, the CBRC, the Sex Now survey. And I think it's important to take that survey because because I know like when I was growing up on the reserve, it's interesting when you were talking about I couldn't define what sexual well-being is was because there's just something that you didn't. There's a lot of stigma and shame around sex to begin with, where the reserve that I come from, and especially being a male, you just don't talk about things like this, and so everything sexual is not talked about, and then so it only belongs with the nurse and the doctor in a private room in the nursing station, but nothing that you don't speak about, especially when it comes to males don't talk about stuff like this to begin with, but even so with sex, talking about sex is something that's not, especially like the there's a lot of stigma and homophobia around even sexuality between two males, for something, as an example. And that's one of the things, and that's how a lot of the sexual infections happen through male to male. And then, but when you don't talk about it and there's stigma around it, it's very difficult to address those issues and to be able to have people to get testing and things like that for people that are high risk at transmitting those diseases, like through sexual activity. So I just wanted to, in terms of my, you were asking how so just basically getting people to talk about it is something really a challenge, but
yeah, totally. And I think what I'm hearing from everyone is that when we try and engage in those conversations, that there are layers of complexity that intersect with our identity, with our partner's identity, and the way that, I guess, society structures itself around those relationships, around that identity, right? And I think it's very apparent in the example that you spoke to, Glenn, in terms of kind of having homophobia, and particularly homophobia that's very rampant or apparent in particular communities or in particular areas. I don't mean just one res, but I mean like, I think we can all think of broad swaths of the country that are still quite homophobic, right? And absolutely, of course, that would add another layer of complexity to having a healthy conversation, like you guys said, engaging with that communications toolkit and protecting yourself and your partner, right? So the survey that you mentioned is kind of a way for people to start that dialogue, I guess, to start that communication.
And I think it's very important because it'll give evidence to exactly how, like for example, men who have sex with other men, it'll give detail of what it will break down in their what kind of types of sex that they have, and so we'll have it on paper. Like there'll be evidence of the types of activities that happens. So it's very important that people take that survey, survey.
Great. So for anybody that's following along at home, we'll have access to that survey that will be posted later on during this for the session for those that want to access it. So we have our first question from the community. Sherry Lynn, I apologize if it's Sherry Lynn or Sherry Lynn. How does the sacredness of the body come into sexual well-being? It's a really good question, a really broad question. Does anybody want to take a tentative step?
I can start.
Okay.
I feel like
Atticus, you're my favorite.
usually it's Amanda, but this is me today. So I feel like it's a sacred act and an act of decolonization to think about our sexual health, especially like as women or two spirits, and in the time of missing and murdered women, girls, and two spirits. I think it's so sacred, even for us to honor and have agency over our sexual health and our bodies. And I feel like one thing I learned from elders that I really, really, really loved hearing, they were like, we were talking about sex one time, and all these elders were like so okay with it. And then one of them said was like, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for sex. And we wouldn't. Like, it's a natural part of life, and I feel like our ancestors, we normalized that. That was a normal conversation. There was no such thing as shame or guilt. We had sex, and that's just a part of being human and a part of being a sacred person. Like, talking about consent, talking about love for yourself. Like, Yuusnewas means taking care of ourselves, taking care of our communities. Like, we have to start taking care of ourselves so we're able to have healthy sexual relationships with our partners. I love having open conversations with my friends and my loved ones and talking about, like, relationships and sexual relationships. Like, I love that openness, and there's a lot of healing in it, especially in a time of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two spirits, because that kind of shame is killing us. That's what it is. Like, we have such high rates of HIV and Hep C. People don't even know their status because there's so much shame and stigma attached to sexual health. And I feel like even just naming it and talking about it openly is sacred. Like, sexual well-being and like healthy sexual well-being is sacred.
Love it.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrea.
Oh, I'm just really excited by the question and your response. I think that, given this context of shame and a lot of also like harmful experiences that the people that are meant to teach us experience, so then there wasn't that open communication that I think we're starting to have now is difficult. And I think about the types of conversations that I, as a younger person, would have liked to have been involved in, or the people that I, what I needed to hear, and that's kind of my approach in this work. And so I think thinking about sacredness to me is really thinking about agency and sovereignty over our bodies. And a lot of people, especially as women identified, and just putting on my youth hat, because I worked or volunteered for a long time with Yuusnewas back in the day, and so I think a lot of people want to tell us what to do with our bodies and how we should experience sexual relationships, and kind of put a lot of expectation, a lot of stigma, and a lot of shame around our sexual experiences. And I think that sacredness to me is having that agency to decide that, it's my body, and I get to decide, my own ways of being around my sexual identity. So I think that's what sacred is, those teachings, and knowing that it starts with me. It's not about what other people kind of decide what's best for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are great. Those are two really great responses. And I think the thing that sticks with me the most is the part that you said, Atticus, about kind of when we talk about holistically loving ourselves and being ourselves, and importantly how that then interacts with the communities that we love and we live and we are a part of. That it is holistic, and your sexual well-being is a part of your holistic wellness, and it's an equal part. It has to be recognized as such. So thank you.
Can I just add?
Yeah, of course, Glenn.
That was an interesting question when you said the distinguishing between wellness and sexual health. And I think in terms of sacredness about sex, I believe that sexuality is sacred,
Mhm.
and there is respect around it and the sacredness. However, I didn't start learning that concept until I was older. When I was younger, maybe it's because of the religion that I was raised in.
Mhm.
Automatically, I was like, when I asked my mom, somebody in the community, we couldn't. There was no one talked about sex.
Mhm.
It was nothing. It was like really terrifying to talk about sex when I was a little boy. And I had a question. Somebody said something sexual outside when I was growing up, and I asked my mom within my community, and I asked what that. I was about 10 or 11. It was about intercourse. Somebody said something about intercourse, and I didn't know what it was. So I had to ask my mom, and she was like, "Oh my God, don't you ever ask me that question again? It is bad. It's," and I was like, "Oh my God." And so it was like,
Mhm.
I learned that sex is horrible.
Yeah.
You don't talk about it.
Mhm.
And but then I'm realizing now that I'm hearing things like sex is sacred. Oh, is it? But when I was young, wasn't told that.
Yeah.
It's actually really
Yeah.
frightened about it. But I do get that, and I think there's a lot of consequences of that. And I think because I got that teaching when I was a young child, it affected me negatively when I grew up. I had a lot of issues around sexuality, and I just. But had I been taught when I was a little boy that sex is sacred, it's respectful, it's love, it's nothing to be ashamed of. There are boundaries around it. If I was taught that, my life would have been so much different than it had been. So and that's something that I'm now learning. So
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that brings up a really good point of kind of generational differences in the way that we look at this. It's beautiful and it's great. It's great that we are now going on the steps of teaching our youth to reclaim their sexuality, both as what that means as an Indigenous person and as a person that looks after their health, like kind of broadly, or their well-being, right? But yeah, it's a really good point to talk about. Generations past, that wasn't the message, and whether or not that comes from let's say gently colonial influences, it's there. We know that it's there, and we know that it affected our communities. But I think if nothing else, that gives greater importance to these conversations that we're having with our youth now, right? To make sure that we're on that process, or on that path, of decolonizing. On that note, it's almost as if you knew exactly where I was going, Glenn. Our next question. So, what are Indigenous perspectives on sexual well-being, and what does decolonizing sexual well-being look like? So I think one of the big ones that we've talked about here is having different kinds of conversations with our youth than I've had in the past, right? But what are other methods of decolonizing our sexual well-being?
Well, I think minimizing shame, and I feel like that shame definitely comes from the church, and that definitely comes from early colonization, that shame around sex, and also the idea of man and woman, and how we're supposed to navigate through life, that rigid shame. I don't know, I feel like shame doesn't really work in trying to make people respectful and healthy and whatnot. And I feel like shame really needs to be, we really need to have those conversations on how shame shapes our youth and how we have relationships when we're adults. Because I grew up with the same thing, don't talk about sex, but my mom left condoms around. She knew I was having sex, but she didn't want to talk to me about it. She was scared. But she wasn't scared enough to leave me condoms, but she couldn't talk about it. And then I watched all the women and everybody in my family be in abusive relationships, and there was a lot of shame about talking about, I'm second generation intergenerational trauma residential school survivor, so I know that a lot of the elders I grew up with had sexual trauma that they were never able to work on, so they weren't able to talk about sex because they weren't working on their sexual trauma. There's not a framework about that, and it's all comes from shame, really, that the church instilled in our people. So when we lose that shame, we're pretty much breaking the shackles of colonization, we're getting rid of shame, and that's where it starts, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think along with what Atticus said is, yeah, you're breaking down those like ideas and ideologies that were brought up through colonization and being able to like reclaim your body and being able to like see all that it is and being able to do the things that make your body and yourself happy, and that will only happen once like we break down that shame. So I think being able to get to like that root like issue and being able to do that is just empowering, and I think goes back to like the last question too, is that like our body like is so sacred and sex is so sacred, but being able to get to that point like again and being able to take control of that is just fantastic.
Yeah.
And a part of, I think, decolonizing like sexual well-being.
Mm-hmm. It's all linked, right?
Yeah.
It all comes together. Yeah. If you don't mind, actually, just a quick follow-up question. So we're talking a lot about kind of throwing off the shackles of shame, I guess, around our sexual well-being. I say that very broadly in terms of like our sexual identity and the relationships that we have and the relationships we have with ourselves. So what does that actually look like? Do you know what I mean? Does that look like having a conversation with youth very early, or kind of what are our personal journeys in doing that? I know, like, myself, I still hold a lot of, I don't want to say shame, but like there is a little bit of discomfort, do you know what I mean, in engaging in these sorts of conversations. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about here, right?
Yes.
That emotion.
Yeah.
So how do we navigate that?
For me, I have a kid, so the kid's 2 years old, and I'm very like, I want to have open conversations with them about it, and I want them to be able to ask me any question, no matter how like offensive or scary it might seem. Like, I want my kid to be able to come to me with anything, and that's another thing, like communication and being open and honest, and like being honest with yourself is like really empowering. I feel being honest with yourself as an Indigenous person is like decolonization, and like I don't want to like, I want to have those conversations with my kid when they're older, because I wasn't given that. So like for me, like unlearning all the stuff that I needed to unlearn, it was like hearing things I didn't like hearing. I had to expose myself to a lot of things I wasn't ready to hear, and then kind of like piecing together why I don't like hearing those things. So I didn't like talking about sex for a long time because I have dealt with childhood sexual trauma. So it's way harder when you're dealing with something in childhood that you don't even have memories attached to. You just have a feeling. So it took like years for me to piece that together, and it took me exposing myself to these conversations, and even though they made me feel uncomfortable, even though I know I was harboring a lot of really bad things, and I had to really like decolonize my ego, I guess, on top of it, because my ego was also getting in the way too, because I was like, I'm better than that. It's like, what does that even mean though? Like that's another symptom of shame. So I don't know, just like exposing yourself to these conversations and kind of realizing why you can't hear things and what that stems from, because usually always it stems from some type of intergenerational thing or some kind of trauma that you experience, or how you associate your relationship with your body. Like, you really have to be like, why am I here? Why am I having these conversations? Why do I feel this way? And you have to keep on asking why. And you really have to call yourself out. Like, you need to be called out too. Like, it's okay when somebody's like, that is really harmful and violent. Like, I remember the first time I heard that, and I didn't want to hear it at first. But after that, it was like, wow, I am racist. I was like, wow. And then I learned all these other things. And then, it's been 6 years now. I've been educating myself. And I feel like I can work through, like, I'm starting to work through things that were really just, like, in the bottom of all this stuff. Like, I feel like I'm not blocking my blessings anymore, and I'm able to hear things. And, I do get defensive sometimes, but, like, I'm human. And realize, so it's a lot of, like, self-reflection, I guess.
in terms of decolonizing, you were saying what I was taught to was there's only two colors when I was growing up. Like there's either you're red or you're blue. Red for the girls, blue for the boys. And then so when I was in the colonized community that I grew up in, like there wasn't any room for, like, it's the same like residential school, right? All the boys were put in one spot and the girls in this, and then they're all look a certain way. So that's colonization. Decolonization would be something where you allow the child to be to have preference, for example, when I was pressured that I'm supposed to like hockey when I was a little boy. I don't like hockey. I still don't like hockey. But I was like the community. I felt like I needed to like hockey.
Right.
But I don't like hockey. No one ever asked me, "Do you like hockey?" And then I was really scared to. Maybe I like figure skating. But then if I admitted that, oh, you're a faggot then. Sorry, I didn't mean to be derogatory, but
in the context of the story, sure.
Yeah. But it's just allowing the child to be their own identity, I think, is something that, and I think one of the things that what colonization is, and I think that I had to take on someone's tradition. Like in my case, it was a Roman Catholic tradition. It's not necessarily my tradition. It was just I was given somebody was giving me responsibility to continue on. Maybe I have a different religion that I'd like to belong to, right? So I think it's just giving that choice, and started forcing someone to believe something that they have their own uniqueness or something like that.
I really like kind of something I think you're getting at, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but that our youth that are born and they're coming into this world, it's almost like we are putting that shame on them. Do you know what I mean? We as a community or we as people are putting that on them by forcing them to do something, or forcing them to silo themselves, or forcing them to classify their relationship, or not even forcing them to do it, but enforcing a siloed sexual identity and relationship on our youth, right? Because at least that's what I'm kind of picking up from your story, right? It's not that it's not like you came into the world feeling shameful about sex. This was something that you learned and that you interacted with, and then it was something that you picked up. That can be really upsetting, like I think as an adult, if we take that message onto ourselves. But on the other hand, in Atticus, in your case, if you just work hard at stepping into that shame and working hard at opening those communication channels with our youth, it means that re-education isn't actually all that complex. Do you know what I mean? It's not like, you know what I mean? It's not like, for me as a grown adult, talking about, and your own journey, Atticus, like we have to step into that shame. It takes years to have a conversation with ourselves and to understand our biases and to deconstruct those things. But with the youth, there isn't that whole pile of stuff that we have to work through before we can start building up healthy sexual well-being. Do you know what I'm saying? Which I actually find is kind of beautiful. Sorry, go ahead, Andrea. Please.
I think, so much of it is, it's so, it has been mentioned so far, as it is so deeply ingrained. I think it's about untangling these thoughts that we have and these experiences. And I know for me, and speaking to your point, Atticus, about being called out, being called in, having these experiences where we're like, whoa, I said that, or, and maybe that's not what I meant, or I said it in the wrong way, and also reflecting on past experiences and really knowing where that fear comes from. And I think for a lot of parents, caregivers, educators, teachers, we have a lot of fear for young people. We're afraid of the responsibilities that come with sexual relationships for them, and we're afraid of disease, and we're afraid of violence, and so we come often from a very fear-based perspective around that, and we shame and stigmatize without even knowing it, because our motivation is we just care for these people that we're working with, and our families, our communities, and we just want people to have a different experience than we did, or to not be involved or to kind of prevent some of those experiences, and so we're not always sharing the best information when we're coming from, well, we're not sharing good information when we're coming from that lens. And so I think that that decolonizing work is really that self-reflection, and I think a big piece of that as well is the language that we use to talk about sexuality, and even with this word well-being, but even concepts like I was in a conversation when we were at that Montreal Indigenous health, what was it?
I forget.
Anyway, it was a
Indigenous Health in
Indigenous Health conference in Montreal that we went to. Anyway, we were in these really interesting conversations, and when we were invited to talk about sexual health, I think maybe it was health and identity, but when we got there was like 50 different subtopics that we could break into groups and talk about, like housing and mental health and two-spirit identity, and like all of these different things that encompass sexual well-being that I didn't really think about before I got there too much. So that was really interesting to me. But the point of that story was I was in this conversation with this person we were kind of generally talking about the sacredness of the body, and they were kind of talking about this idea of like virginity, and like this idea that you're like giving away or someone's taking. And I think like just that concept is so stigmatizing and loaded, and like even thinking about that one piece in particular, like changing our language, changing our thought process is the decolonizing work.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it comes out, and I think that's where people learn a lot, right? It's not in these explicit conversations that we're having about sexuality with youth. It's in the implicit messages that we carry in our everyday actions, in our conversations, not even with the youth, with each other, right? That's where we're picking up these kind of like communal values, I suppose. Sure. So Sherry Lynn, again, I feel like I'm saying that wrong, but Sherry Lynn, so what I'm hearing is that knowing self is a key point to moving through trauma and acknowledging emotions connected to trauma, plus staying away from shame. Would we agree with that one? And generally,
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. So leading into our last question, or not our last, my last prompt question, I guess. The value of peer and youth involvement to share perspectives and experiences on how best to support conversations on sexual well-being. So I guess this one kind of steers more towards those of us that work with youth a lot, but what is the value that they have in participating in those conversations, and then importantly supporting them, I suppose, away from these breakout dialogues that you guys facilitate? Like the youth that take something away from that and then have more, you know what I mean? They champion those values.
Can you rephrase your question?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a group of
lost.
Indigenous youth, right?
Yes.
And they come to a session put on by Nona and Atticus. They learn a lot of cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
But then they go out into the world. And you guys go out and do your thing, whatever it is that you do. Maybe you go pick up milk and have cereal. That's what I like to do. But these youth, they live and they exist in their community, right? So what is the value and importance of having those youth support that conversation further with each other? Do you know what I mean? To champion that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think just having like those conversations and teaching youth about like all of these things, and just kind of for them to even recognize that this is like a part of life, and there are like folks everywhere that have these ideas, and it's not all the same that they've seen. So like the way I grew up, like again, it was a very like sex and like identity and all those things were very like shameful, and we didn't talk about it, and it was like, I think like Andrea said, it came from like a really good place of like protection, but I think I ended up in situations and making choices that were probably not the best for myself because I didn't know any different, and I didn't see that in like the relationships around me with my family or my friends or anything. So I think having this like different like knowledge about the topics is going to help youth just be able to make positive decisions for themselves, because everybody has that different relationship with sexuality and sexual well-being, and being able to just realize that is just like amazing. And I think so often we kind of try to like shelter like youth and children over these topics, and I'm all about sharing this information. It's not bad information, and it's been like proven that like the more you know about something, like the better decisions that you're gonna make. And I think allowing and giving space for youth to be able to like explore that for themselves and being able to figure out those things is what is going to help change, and being able to break down those different types of shame and being able to explore like what's happening within themselves.
Empowering youth with knowledge to make a decision for themselves,
Yeah.
as opposed to setting up some sort of boundary or barrier. That's kind of what I'm picking up, right?
Yeah, I love, I'm like an open book. And I love talking about my experiences and my stories. Like, I'm a really big storyteller. And I love going into workshops and, like, kind of creating and opening up the space. And I get people to open up to me really well. And especially, like, I was former youth in care. I was former homeless youth. So I guess, like, I kind of, like, spiritually feel connected to a lot of Indigenous youth, because we share the same kind of experiences. And I feel like that relationship I have from the get-go with the youth kind of makes them more comfortable talking about sex and talking about relationships and talking about consent, because those are like really needed conversations that I wish I had when I was younger. And I feel so good when I get to teach youth new things, and I feel good, actually. I love it. It's like something I would do, like, I even do in my spare time. Like, I do a lot of activism and, like, organizing in my spare time. So this is just a part of my survival. And it feels so rewarding to see youth have things that I didn't have. I was only born in the 90s. So, like, I'm like a younger millennial. But even, like, me, I didn't have those things. So even being a parent, like, it's so cathartic and healing to be able to show up for youth and, the younger generation in a way that wasn't happening for you. So there's, like, healing involved in that too. And there's a lot of healing in this work that we do, I feel like. And, like, to be able to, like, our HIV 101 workshop is, like, has so much, like, information in it, and like, it's cool to see the little evaluations with, like, the youth being like, I learned so much, and it's like, yay. It feels really good. And I think that the youth really, like, it really, like, opens them up and starts those conversations, because they don't want to talk about sexual health with their parents. They don't want to talk about sexual health with their teacher. They don't want to talk about sexual health with their, nurse or counselor and stuff. Like, we're youth going into youth spaces, and we're like, we're not professors. We're not on the top of that hierarchy. We're your peers. And I feel like that really is a good way to talk about it and open it up.
Can I share about youth? When I think it's important that that the youth are comfortable having these conversations, to be aware, to be educated, to be informed. I know when my niece is a teenager, and I try to have these conversations. Maybe it's because I'm not in the right place to do it, but I just want to be her to be aware but I feel like she's really, it's uncomfortable. Well, it would be, right? But it's just, it's not easy to talk about these topics with youth. And I think, but it's important that they're aware. And I was thinking, I'm reflecting about when I was her age, when I was young. I was young in the 90s, right? So at that time, there was so much stigma around HIV, and so if you were gay back in the 90s, there was, HIV stuff, right? So, but it was. I remember someone asked me, I came out there, I got into a fight because somebody called me a faggot. So, and then I got into trouble, so they sent me to a therapist when I was 17 years old, back in the 90s, and then someone asked me, at that time, are you, there was a lot of stigma around there, like in the 90s, that counselor asked me, blurted it out, I was at the door, are you gay? And then I was like, it really terrified me because there was so much stigma in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Like that question was, if I didn't trust her. I just met that counselor, right? If I had told that counselor, I felt like it's gonna leak out into the community and the other kids are going to attack me. I didn't have a lot of, I didn't feel protected.
It's about self-preservation, safety, right?
Yeah. And then, but I wish I was comfortable enough to had that conversation with that counselor. If there was respect, or if there was trust, if she had established trust with me,
Mm-hmm.
if I knew I was safe in that room, and that I knew that I was safe, I would have been open to have that conversation with her, and my life would have went way better than it had.
Mm-hmm.
It's all around the stigma around sexuality, and it's just very important to build that trust, to have that open conversation.
Yeah. Actually, that brings up a really good point, and maybe something I'll address kind of broadly to the group here. I have seven nieces and nephews and godchildren, all under the age of 5, right? So this isn't a conversation that I'm gearing up to have like this weekend, right? But it is something that I would want to have if they were open to having that. I suppose if we all felt like it was the right place and the right time and I was the right person. What would be your suggestion to someone like me as an older member of the family? Wow, older. I just put myself into a category there. Do you know what I mean? To start having that, or to start bridging that gap, because it exists.
Yeah.
There's a gap there, and we have to build that trust. But how do we signal to the young people in our families or in our communities that we're a safe place to have that conversation? What would be your suggestions, I guess, broadly to the group?
I think being clear with intent, and like always being clear with the intent, like, hey, I really care about your well-being, and like I want to talk about these things with you when you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
And like giving them the agency to open up to you, or be like, figure out if they're talking to their friends and stuff. Like, I don't know, because you don't necessarily have to talk with them, right?
Yeah, as
Like,
long as they're having it.
yeah,
as long as they're
and,
having the
like,
conversation.
The mind frame of youth nowadays is like completely different than like when I was a kid.
Mhm.
So I know that, like, I've heard kids on the bus and in workshops and whatnot, like the kids are like, their mind frame is changing. Like the younger they are, it's like the more like woke they're getting. It's like, whoa. Anyway, sorry. So like, you necessarily don't even need to have those conversations with them, because they're going to have those conversations elsewhere where they feel comfortable. Because, like, no offense, I'd feel weird if my uncle was like, I'd be like, no, I'm not talking to you. I'd be like, I'll talk to auntie, not you. So even just, like, maybe trying to talk to the other adults in your family and seeing if they're on the same page and if they're even having those conversations in their everyday to-day life. Like, I guess starting where you can go, and like you might not be able to get to the youth right away and open up to them, and you don't want to pry them open either, and you don't want to like target them, because we feel that it doesn't feel good, it feels weird, makes you feel more unsafe because of the stigma. So even just like starting with the adults, like their parents, and being like trying to change their shame and having conversations with their shame around sexual health and sexual well-being and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I just you mentioned something. Yeah, it would be weird, right? But I just felt kind of like defensive a little bit about that. But I do see it. But I just wish I didn't have to feel like I had to. I wish that the community, because where I come from, I see a lot of teen pregnancies, like 14, 15-year-olds having babies. How come no one's having these discussions with these children?
Yeah.
Why do I feel like I'm, as an uncle, feeling like I have to have these conversations? I shouldn't. Maybe I'm just being codependent and I'm trying to fix everybody's problems. Maybe I need to step aside. But I could see all these unwanted pregnancies and all these. You know what I mean? I wish I didn't have to feel like I need to step in. If the community could have these conversations inappropriately with their children.
Yes.
Well, and I think that's, sorry if I may, I think that's the big point that we're kind of coming at here, is that in some areas that the health or the sexual well-being of the community, and I say that very broadly in terms of the way that people are structuring their conversations, the activities that people are engaging in, the stigmas that may or may not exist, in some places it isn't healthy. That's just factual, right? So well, I think it brings up, it's two different perspectives. Do you know what I mean? And how do we, not two different perspectives, but it's challenging if we know that isn't. If we know that those conversations aren't happening in a safe way or in a good way. And I think, Atticus, your point about kind of coming almost indirectly around to the adults and the parents, right? That's kind of what you were saying, right? To have that conversation with them so that we can kind of kickstart that, hopefully, that conversation with others. But it's difficult. It's tough. It's really hard.
And change takes time. It takes a lot of time, especially. Like, I grew up in an area where there was a lot of teen pregnant. I'm even surprised I didn't have a kid when I was young. Like, honestly, I wasn't, like, I didn't know anything about sexual health or anything. And I, was very high risk at one point. Well, still kind of am, but, it's a different story. Yeah, it takes time, and I understand your urgency and scarcity and being like, I have to fix these things, and like I feel so bad for these babies because I care about babies a lot. Like, babies are my number one priority in life. Like, babies, like, I want to take all the babies, but like I have to respect my own boundaries and my own mental health. Like, I can't fix everybody, and it doesn't just start with one person. That's the reality. And like, I can only do so much. And like, it sucks when you feel like you can't help your communities. It hurts. It's like a different type of ache, especially when you're on your journey of healing and you're feeling those feelings that nobody else is feeling. And I feel like you collectively feel all those feelings, and like, it's hard.
Yeah.
And it sucks to sit there and be like, I can't save everybody. I can't help everybody. I can't make people open up. So it's like, we have to like take a few steps back and then figure out a new game plan and how we're going to do it. And if they keep on failing, then we got to go back, do it differently. So it takes time. That's the thing. And I feel like, even for myself, I feel like I'm too ahead of my time with being like radical and whatnot. Like, I just feel like nobody's on the same page as me, and I hate that. So I get that urgency and I get that scarcity, because I do get hopeless sometimes, and it's so hard to stay focused on it. But then again, that's when I need to take time for myself and my mental health and my well-being, because it's so easy to kind of fall into that. Like, I need to help people. I can't, like, I understand it. Like, my family is in Saskatchewan, which is completely different political atmosphere than BC, and harm reduction is not practiced in the way that it is here. And this conversation we're having at this table now doesn't necessarily happen at all. It was a city though, so I get it. It's really hard.
Yeah, I think if you can't be that person for somebody, whether it be in your community or your immediate family, then I think like a way that you can go into that is just being like that positive role model of either just having those conversations with other people or navigating your own self and your own relationships and your own sexual well-being in a good way. Then I think that is like a step in the right direction, and that's how like them watching you and viewing you and seeing that, it will, I think, enact some sort of like change, and it'll be like helpful, because I think it would be like wonderful if I would be able to see like all the people around me being in like happy, healthy relationships and like being open and having open dialogue with everybody else.
Or know what consent is. And I feel like, especially Indigenous communities, a lot of people don't know what consent is. I didn't even know what consent was. I didn't even know I had agency over my own body. And like, being Indigenous people being put through assimilation and genocide, we feel like we don't have agency over our bodies.
I think the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, they have some really awesome documents on like that violence on the land is violence on our bodies, and talking about, well, we don't even have consent as to what happens on our land and on our territories in a way, so like, and how that affects the consent of our bodies, and thinking about also in that idea of well-being, that interconnectivity of, I think a lot of people wouldn't immediately make that connection of how we're so connected and affected by what happens to the land, but it also ties into like reproductive justice and these, I mean, there's so many interconnections that I think are on our minds when we have these conversations, and to the point of to kind of modeling or talking about sexual well-being in good ways. I think I would just piggyback off what was said earlier around making it open. So I think it's kind of, I would say it's, I mean, I don't know what it is like otherwise, but I think as working in sexual well-being and having a role as an educator, it makes it a bit easier to bring it up with family and with friends because it's my job. So it's like automatically assume that, you know, we're talking about sexual health and well-being. And so that's, for me, kind of led to some interesting conversations at times. And I think opened up conversations that otherwise wouldn't happen. And also working within my own families and relationships to challenge like heteronormativity and like shaming around sexuality and really like maybe not necessarily like I definitely, you know, talking with the younger people in my family, but definitely talking with like the adults and saying like, hey, you know, like just opening up people's minds to what they're not aware of, because I think like in terms of decolonizing and also recognizing our own biases, like that's work to be done. And so I think for me, like kind of bringing those pieces to light is important for me.
I went to a workshop yesterday, and I think that something that I need to practice doing is that listening skills, that being to listen. I have this tendency, maybe it's because I'm biologically a cis man, or maybe that's what it is, but I want to fix it, right? But there's that. However, and I learned that when someone's grieving, whatever, it's better to just listen, right? And I think that's where I get my niece probably. She gets irritated with me because I want to fix her, right? I want to, you know, but I don't. She doesn't want to be fixed, right? Yeah. And I need to learn to, like, learn that attention, listening skills to just listen and not fix her. Yeah. So that's something that I need to practice.
Totally. Yeah. And I appreciate your guys' perspectives and all of your answers. It was greatly informed the way that I will approach the relationship with all 7 of my young ones.
I have 10.
Yeah. See, we all know. Christmas is a nightmare for me. So Charlotte asked, what are other ways of starting conversations with youth about sexual well-being? I like Atticus's example of being clear with content. Yeah. Does anyone else? We have any other examples of how we can start that conversation? I think we've also talked about starting the conversation with adults, and we've also talked about positive role modeling as a way to at least signal that you're open and available to have that. Does anybody else?
I think I would really be interested, especially what our youth in this conversation have to say. But I think for me,
you're gesturing to me for a second.
Is really being like making sure we are the right person. Is like, you know, we all have this good intention of wanting to help, but really making sure that we're the right person. And what I mean by that is like making sure we're ready to hear what might come up. And so sometimes if it's like our niece or nephew or you know, a close family member, it's tough. And so one of my friends was telling me this story. She works in sexual health as well, or sexual well-being, and doing some education and whatnot. And so she's made herself an available, open person, and she has several younger siblings, and so she's said a lot, like, talk to me if you need anything, talk to me if you want help. And so one day her sister talked to her, and her sister was a young teenager, and she told her that she thinks she might be pregnant. And so my friend didn't know that her sister was sexually active, and so she had all these things that she was quite shocked by. And so I think body language and tone is so important in these conversations as well. And so she said she kept her cool, and she offered her sister some resources and took her where she needed to go, and to her, like, whatever she needed. And I thought I was so impressed, I guess, and kind of like thinking about, well, wow, what would I do if I was in that scenario? Like, I think we all have this desire to help, but I think really thinking about what would happen in these scenarios when we heard something we were shocked by, I think is really a thing.
That's a good point. Sorry, go ahead, Glenn.
And I think where I was going to go with this, I think there's an adult, or I think it's like the young people. Sometimes I feel like as an adult, we need to, rather than trying to fix young people or do whatever, I think we need to do our own healing work. Isn't it like where I need to, instead of picking on my nieces and nephews, I need to ask myself, where do I need to do work within myself? Do I need to address issues in my own? Do I need my own healing circles? Have I looked at my introspection and where I could better myself and heal myself? And I think that's like role modeling, right? I'm showing example. I'm not preaching to my nieces and nephews about sexual health. I'm actually, by doing my own work, I'm being a role model, or I'm showing, or by working on me. So,
yeah, definitely. And I like one of the pieces that I'm pulling away from both of you guys' responses is that process is continuous, right? Regardless of where you are on that journey, there's still work for you to do. There's still work. There's still things that you can work through and look inside for. So I really appreciate that. Honestly, this conversation has been illuminating for me personally. We have another question from the community. So something I'm struggling the most with sexual health and well-being is managing in a hookup culture. I was wondering if anyone could speak to self-worth and how to grow in a healthier way in that regard. Not feeling sadness when there is physical intimacy and nothing past that. I think it is a very contemporary thing, right?
Yeah.
The prevalence of dating apps.
Oh yeah.
I think we're all aware of what those are.
I have.
I got something to say.
Yeah, I've had that problem, and I still have that problem. I think I uploaded Tinder like last month, and then I was like, do I put my kid on my profile or do I not put my kid on my profile? And I was like, I'm not going to put my kid on the profile this time. And I got all these replies, and I was like, yeah. And then I went on these dates with people, and I was like, I have a kid, and they got weird. They would leave, and I felt like shit after.
Yeah.
And one thing that really helped with me is just not dating, and that's just what helped me, like online dating, like no online dating, because it's always ended badly. And I mean, like, I'm not a person that can, just do hookup culture anymore. Like, I'm older now, I have a kid, and like the way I view my body is a lot different, and like the way I view the world's a lot different, and I'm very aware of everything. So I still get low self-esteem from a lot of experiences and whatnot. And honestly, like, I feel like online dating is really toxic, because even my friends that do it, it's not a good time for anybody. Like, hookup culture is so disposable now. People just are, and like, sexual, like, having sex with somebody, having casual sex with them still requires like respect, boundaries, consent, treating the people like, a human. And I feel like people work in a vacuum, and they want as many people as they want. And like, I feel like nobody sticks around long enough to be able to have a conversation with them and what their values are and how they treat people. And that's another thing where shame shows up in our conversations around sexual health. Shame is really written in online dating. And like, I'm queer, so I'll date anybody. Doesn't matter who I'm dating. It's the same thing. Like,
I feel like we could do a whole learning circle on online dating.
Yeah, we should. I feel like I would be so down with that.
I feel like I totally appreciate what you said, and I think for anyone that's ever done online dating, like, absolutely a true experience. But I think that it's also can be a really liberating experience. So for people that like are like excited and jazzed up by like hookup culture, like I think it has both positive elements and harmful elements at the same time. And I think for a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't have these opportunities to meet, or they're like, we all have these different ways of experience. Like, we're talking about sexual well-being. I think sexuality is a distinct part of that, and so we all have different ways of expressing our sexuality. And so I think for some people there is a lot of benefit, or they get a lot of benefit out of hookup culture as well. And whether or not we're one of those people that's another question, but I think I kind of see both sides of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think like if like that's what we want to do, that's amazing and awesome, and you do it. But I think just being aware of like of your own like body and your own needs. So like if that's the path that you want to take, but you're feeling a little bit lacking in your relationships and conversations, that you can find those in so many different areas. Like your like the intimacy and like the conversations and like those relationships, like they don't solely have to be like romantic relationships. You can find that like validation in
And intimacy.
yeah,
in other
within-
relationships.
yeah, with your friends, your family, and all those things. So I think being aware of like how you're fulfilled by that and like where you can do that, it's going to be different for every person. But I think exploring yourself and finding those ways would be like a great way to do that, because you have to take care of yourself, and I think you can do that whether you're in a relationship or you're hooking up.
That's such a good point.
One thing I would like to talk about too about hookup culture and desirability. Desirability is also like misogyny can really cloud how you are attracted to people. White supremacy can really cloud how you're attracted to people. Fat phobia can really cloud how you are attracted to people, and that really shapes what we're into even on a societal level. And I feel like if you're not like a skinny white person with like no deformities on your body, like you're able-bodied, you tend to have a way more easier time with hookup culture, because you don't have all that body issues, self-esteem issues that tend to come with like me. I'm brown and I'm fat and I'm not able-bodied, so and I have a kid, so there's like a lot of intersections I have with online dating that make it difficult for me to have a good time. And like also because I used to be homeless, I used to be a drug addict, so like as soon as I bring that up to somebody on Tinder, they're like okay, I don't like addiction, my mom is like, and then they're projecting all these like bias and harmful things on me, and then that's why I don't have a good time on online dating. I'm not saying people should stop completely, but for me, it's been better that way. And like I had to reprogram my brain into getting intimacy from my best friends in way like we go for dinner together, we hold hands, and we wear each other's clothes, and like we have sleepovers and sleep in the same bed, and like I love that. Like I get that. I have somebody calling me every day, messaging me every day. Like I don't need all of that, and like sometimes I do just want to fuck, and it doesn't happen because I'm not seen as a desirable person. So you come out of that not feeling good, and especially being two-spirited. Oh my god. Even with white queers, it's like once you say two-spirited, it's like even they're weird. So it's like it's hard. It's really, really, really hard. But like learning how to reprogram your brain to get the things that you want out of a relationship, and like kind of expecting like, yeah, if I hook up with this person, that's all it is, and you have to learn how to just leave it at that. Because I'm poly, I'm non-monogamous, and like even today I have jealousy problems that I need to work on, and self-esteem issues, and I need extra like love and attention after my partner goes on dates with other people. So it's like it's constantly working on yourself. But sometimes it's like I had to be celibate for 1.5 years after I left an abusive relationship. After I got off of drugs, like I needed that time for myself, because I was just, again, sex is sacred. We give, when we're having sex with people, we're giving our time and our space to people. Like some people can be really negative energies and whatnot, and you're letting them in your space and in your time, and they're putting bad medicine, I like to think of it, like in your zone, because you have to really protect it, right? So
but online, you were talking about online dating, and I think there's in the gay community, I think there's I know a couple that met through online, but it may not be Grindr. Something else they met.
Right.
They met.
Grindr's the one though.
But I'm not sure, because I've seen Grindr in the gay community. It's all about, it's like a meat market. It's not. It seemed like like people have multiple, and they just, as you say, it's an image too, right? And there's I think there's racism too. Like sometimes like
Of course. Yeah.
in it.
Yeah.
So, but online, from what I've seen, Grindr may not be a healthy place. I don't know. That's just my opinion. So that's why I don't really go.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thread that I'm picking up across all of the answers here is that really it comes down to what we were talking about before in that it's really about self-work. It's about knowing who you are, right?
Mhm.
And if you know that,
Mhm.
then you can access
Yeah. Yeah.
these let's call them tools
Mhm.
that, you know.
It's a toolkit, online dating toolkit.
Yeah, you can use those
Next
things
project.
responsibly,
Yeah.
and not just responsibly for yourself, but responsibly for others, right? If you know that there's something that you know, I'm trying to think of, I can't think of an example, but if you know there's something that you do sometimes that could be hurtful to other people, especially in like a poly space, right? Or let's say a casual dating space, and not to confuse those two terms because I know they're not the same, but like casual dating, let's say online dating space, correct myself, then maybe that's not the right tool for you, and you can abstain. Or I never did. I've been in a relationship through the entire time of that thing. So online dating is like a distinct thing to me. It's like a fairy world that I've never even seen. So I appreciate your guys' perspectives and experiences in it because I recognize that it can be tough and it's challenging, particularly for those of us that struggle with our own measures of self-worth and have the intersectionalities of online dating.
Yeah. I also think it's so much, I think another thread that we kind of talked about is that self-reflection. And so sometimes we find out what we like or even don't like by doing it. And so I think with online dating, like for some of us, like we might try it out and say like, wow, I really don't like a casual dating thing. And like I found it out because I tried it, or, like that is one example. So I think also to like not be hard on ourselves in that way, because I think there is so much shame about casual dating. There is so much shame about hookup culture. And I think, I just think like to have like that self-reflection is such a big part of it, and just also not like self-shaming or self-stigmatizing our own selves when we're just trying to like find out about ourselves. Yeah, just trying to exist in this world.
Yeah, it's like it's okay to do it, and then it's okay to be like, no, this is not for me. Like it's okay. Like one of the things, especially being poly, I was like, I can't have serious relationships, like serious feelings for people. I can't love them. I can't have jealousy. So I tried really hard to like stuff those feelings down when I first tried polyamory like 6 years ago. It's been a while, and like I hurt myself a lot during the way because I would be like in love with people and I wouldn't be able to say it, and I got hurt like a lot, and that came from shame because I felt I was in a poly like community. I felt I wasn't able to be like, hey, I don't like hookup culture. Hey, I don't feel empowered by it. Like it's okay to say that. It's okay to be like, I feel empowered by it too. It's totally fine. Like I know a lot of people who do, but then I know a lot of people who don't like it. So it's like it's okay either way. Yeah.
Wherever you are on that spectrum, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have lots of other questions. So one of the ones that we'll chat about, because I think it's interesting. It's easier for me to think about how to talk about sexual wellness and how to unpack shame with youth and children, and harder for me to think about how to do that with people in my life who are older, parents, grandparents, elders. How can we have conversations like this with those people in particular when they've experienced trauma that causes them to perpetuate harmful ideas about gender and sexuality?
Yeah. I mean, I would say in my role, like we primarily do get workshop requests for youth, and when we do, we will invite and include Yuusnewas, and I would say that's 98%, and then the 2% is like nurses who want to know about, how to make sure they're talking about sexual health in a good way. And
nurses
maybe,
are beautiful people. They realize.
Yeah. 0.5 is this a new emergence of nurses and like local healthcare providers who are like, we want to talk. Parents and caregivers want to know more about how to talk about sexual health and healthy sexuality and the sexual well-being in a good way. And so I think like as we have these conversations and people learn more about it, or they know that they need to know because they're younger people in their lives need to know, I think as that comes up, then it opens up a space. And so, but I think it's hard because as adults and as sometimes health educators or health service providers within the community, we have to have this feeling like we're the experts, and so it's really hard to kind of seek that knowledge or ask those questions when we're just supposed to know it. Like, it's kind of embarrassing to, even though so many people have had like very little, if not zero, or just not good information around sexual well-being. So I think just kind of putting that on the table for conversation, recognizing that we don't have, creating that safer space of where people can ask questions and recognize that we all have this ongoing learning, we all have a lot to learn, and I think approaching it from that way, as well as asking people what they would like to know, you know, rather than coming with an agenda of what we think like everyone should know. So that's kind of my approach to it.
I like that, emphasizing that lifelong learning component, because I feel like a lot of the times when you have these conversations like you talk about with older people, with elders, grandparents, or whatever, it can come across as a very deficit-focused conversation about like, you are this age and you don't know this. Do you know what I mean? But really just talking about everyone being continually progressing towards some unattainable goal, really, that is, you know, perfection in your sexual well-being, I suppose. I don't think it's a perfect thing. I think it's just something that you always want to grow and you always want to learn, because you're always going to meet somebody else that brings a different perspective or a different experience you didn't think about. You know what I mean? I agree. I think just emphasizing that part, that it's not about covering a deficit, it's about how can we grow. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, and I'm just excited about this question because I think about it a lot. Also, so I studied health sciences and gerontology, so like the study of aging, and so we did a little bit of work around aging and sexuality, and I think for a lot of like
That's
older
an interesting
people,
question,
and
too.
like that's a whole other can
That's
of
a
worms
whole other
because
thing.
of some of those difficulties and the negative experiences that people have around sexuality, especially being older, like elderly or older, as well as like a lot of people were at those times like in like monogamous relationships for most of their lives, and you know, and now, and also like there's a stigma around older people having sex. Like people are like,
Totally.
I think it's internalized and expressed by society, like that old people don't have sex, and if they do, it's not cool, you know. And so I feel like that's a whole other kind of worms that is pretty much yet to be explored, but I think it's like it's happening, and like people really don't have ways of talking about it and openly or positively. And so I think that's, I mean, I don't have an answer for that one at this time, but I guess it's kind of like peer work, maybe like working with the people who are older people who are interested in teaching others, maybe. I don't know, but I think about that a lot.
I think it would be a suggestion, like I was thinking about how to answer that question. I was thinking of my friend. I was talking to a friend in one province, and he was saying that there was a lot of stigma. He wanted to have a LGBT conference.
Okay.
And how they did it was they had an anonymous in a city where they had this conference, and then he just kind of went moccasin telegraphing, right? So they all got to that conference without being publicized, right? It's just an anonymous conference, and and then not everyone knew what that conference was. Even the hotel didn't know, right? So, but they were meeting. It went word of mouth, and then so that's how they gather with it, like a discreetly and kind of like without announcing it publicly, kind of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I don't have like a concrete answer for any of this. I think it's going to be different in every situation, and everybody's at a different place. I think within like my own relationships of like my like parents or my grandparents or something, I think it's it's constantly, you're constantly working on that to be able to have those conversations with them and being able to like teach them new things. And like they haven't fully been open to all of that, but I think building that relationship like slowly and building those steps to be able to do that is the way I've been approaching that. And slowly I think they've kind of come around to different ideas and like who I am like as a person and with my like sexual well-being and my like my own like identities. And I think it's been a long process, but I think building that up for like meeting them where they're at and building that relationship to be able to do that, it's going to take time, and I think maybe it'll get like maybe a little bit easier over time now that I think like the youth that are like coming up are just so fantastic and so open, and they can see that, and I think that might be able to maybe help out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Like everything else, I think Atticus said it earlier, right? That change takes time.
Mm-hmm.
So we have one more question that we just have to get at because it's a great question. I was wondering if anyone is able to speak to the tension that sometimes occurs between living as modern people and honoring traditional teachings about sexuality. I've been taught some things that I have a hard time fitting into my life around menstruation, sexual relations, gender identity, reproductive choice, and often they are discussed as being part of our traditional Indigenous ways of being. Is this something that any of you have ever experienced, and if so, do you have any tips for navigating those conversations?
I definitely have. As being a two-spirit person, I did end up having a baby, but I see it. It's a different experience for me than other like mothers or whatever, and my parenting is a lot different than like. But yeah, I've definitely been in spaces, and I've definitely met elders who like called me an abomination and like confused and mentally ill, stuff like that. I've been in where I grew up in Saskatchewan. Ceremony was very rigid. Women sit on one side, men sit on the other. Women wear skirts. They have to cover their arms and their chest and everything. And we had to speak Cree too at some of the sweat lodges, like only Cree, and I can't speak Nahuian, so I couldn't participate. I was scared to participate because even back then I was very gender variant, even though I didn't have the language for it, and it kind of scared me off. And sadly, I haven't participated in any of the ceremonies back home and with my family. I've actually had to seek out different ceremony that is specific to two-spirit people because, you know, I do menstruate. I grew up with those teachings too where I wasn't supposed to be in ceremony and I wasn't supposed to be touching certain things and I wasn't supposed to be doing that because I'm on my moon time. And it never really sit right with me as a two-spirit person, and sadly I had to remove myself from those types of ceremonial spaces. I haven't been able to participate and be able to, you know, have those conversations with people because it's too much for me and it's my livelihood on the line at this point. It's who I am, and I don't have time to debate that anymore. I've done that a lot, and I just don't have time to do that. And yeah, I've had to remove myself from ceremonial spaces where I've been targeted for being two-spirit, and it's hard to navigate. Even today, like, it's hard to navigate, and it still really hurts me and strikes me in a different type of way. So I don't even really know how I'm navigating it right now. I'm kind of like blocking it out because it's kind of like hurting me a lot because I'm not able to participate in ceremony back home, and I feel like there's a lot of power in that.
Could I share my opinions about this? I have opinions about this. I don't know, like, 'cause I'm a cis man, right? So I don't know about that part of the world, being cis woman.
Yeah.
However, I've been around ceremonies a lot. That's where I've done a lot of my healing. That's where, when I was younger, I got a lot out of it. However, I've been observing that a lot of Christian teachings have been brought into the ceremony as disguised as tradition and is very strict. And I could be wrong about this, but that's my observation.
Yeah.
Things like when you're residential school, they were very strict on our parents, their grandparents, like, you must do this, you have to do. And, you know, that's why I see in a traditional, like I said, I've been around to ceremony, and I see people who get up with their feathers and their traditional regalia. You have to go like this. You must. And it's almost like this. They became the Queen of England. Like they have this sword. Like you gotta obey me. And in a tradition, disguised as ceremonies or part of it. And then I'm questioning: is this really a ceremonial way of our ancestors, or is it influenced by England because you want power, you want to be right? And then that's been and I can tell I've had a lot of energy around this because I've observed that. And I go to my ceremonies and people are like that, like they're so superstitious too. Like they'll be like, you drop something and then you're in a ceremony, you drop something and then somebody will say, oh, that's a bad or there's something like bad medicine or something like that's because they're not living right or this type of they're all fear-based, influenced by colonial Christian, and then now they just dressed it up as tradition. So I'm always like questioning, like when I'm going to ceremonies, like is this really authentically Indigenous based ceremony, or how many percent of it is influenced by colonial, oppressive, religious dogma that has made its way into these ceremonies? That's kind of like how
I think, and absolutely. I think the influences are there, and it's plain to see for all. I think it may just be one of those, and this is my opinion, it may just be one of those realities where our histories, and I say histories plural, for different nations across the world, are so entangled at this point that it is difficult to parse them out and fully separate them because of the reality of our colonial history. At the same time, we have what we have, and this is the way that the knowledge has survived in whatever way that it has. And I hope that in the future, our cultures and our culture and our teachings and our languages survive and strengthen to the point where we will feel comfortable as a people in letting them evolve. And I say that you can think of a language as a really good example, right? Where there's where we look at very strict kind of pronunciations and strict words, and we don't allow the expansion of vocabulary, and you have to speak it in a very specific way, and that's because of those colonial influences, right? Because of how often our languages have either been destroyed or eradicated, either been eradicated or to the point of eradication. And we only have on record for those communities, we only have, 3 elders speaking, right? Who's to say what component of that speech is, do you know what I mean? Like where that is traditional and where that is true, because those are the only records that we have, right? That's all we have. So through the act of wanting to preserve them, I think, or wanting to preserve that knowledge, I think that's where a lot of that rigidity comes from. But the other side of that, the reality is that languages and cultures and ceremonies, they change, they evolve. They're living things, right? And I think that's part of, or it's a delicate balance that we have to walk as Indigenous people, is how much of those things do we stick true to, and how much do we let evolve with the people, us as people, as the times change. It's difficult. It's a hard thing to navigate, for sure.
I feel like as a Two-Spirit person too, because so many of our Two-Spirit teachings are gone with time, and I feel like a lot of Two-Spirit youth and a lot of Two-Spirit people, we're like creating our own history, our own ceremony, our own like we're remaking it. And I feel like as Indigenous people, our ancestors do send messages to us through our dreams, through our subconscious, like, and I feel like we'll hear certain teachings, and our ancestors will tell us no. Yeah, this is not. No. And I feel like even just knowing in your heart that it's not right, like that's enough. And like, as I said, as being a Two-Spirit person, a lot of my teachings that there's none, and especially with Moontime teachings, I got taught like the church way of thinking of Moontime, and like, this is why you can't do this because women are people that menstruate are bad and they have bad spirits. But I heard an elder rephrase it and be like, no, that's a time when you're self-cleansing and you're really powerful, so you don't need to go to sweat lodges, you don't need to go to ceremony at that time, but you can if you want to. But having those teachings rephrased, because I feel like people take those teachings and they kind of, damper what the church residential school and whatnot done, and they kind of be like, oh, this is why people with periods can't do so and so. It can't, like, I burn sage whatever on my Moontime, I go to ceremonies and we're fine, nobody's dead. So like like, and also like that's just something I felt in my being. I was like, this is right for me. This is part of my healing. This is like, I don't care what my mushroom or like my family's telling me about moon time and how I'm tainting a ceremonial space, which I think really ties into misogyny. So yeah. Sometimes you just know.
We could honestly have an entire circle on culture, ceremony, and tradition, and how that is evolving or not evolving with time. So I think it's a really complex question, and I appreciate everybody's perspectives on it. At this time, we are 5 minutes over, though, so we do have to say goodbye. I don't want to keep you guys. I know you're all very busy, so I just wanted to say thank you to everyone again for your perspectives. Yes, of course, Andrew, please. Yeah.
I also want to thank everyone because I kind of invited all these folks to be here, and I just wanted to mention that for the Yuusnewas team, the team that I'm on, the Chimamuk team, is that we're based out of Vancouver, but that we can travel to different communities in the province to support these conversations. Or if you wanted to email us and just ask for different ideas and supports around planning your own sessions or events around sexual well-being, then I think that's something that we can offer.
How would communities or individuals get in contact with you guys?
Can we share our emails with you? And you post them?
I'm asking. Yeah. If you guys are comfortable with that, we're more than happy to do that. Okay. So that information will be made available to everybody that wants to have these lovely people come and visit you. So again, thank you all very much for coming and participating. I really appreciated it. I think it's been a really informative circle. I've learned a lot. So hi, Tsepka, to all of you gathered here today. I really appreciate it. This is our last learning circle of the calendar year. So I guess I'll see everybody in January. Have a safe and warm holiday, and I wish nothing but the best for you and your family during this time. So hi, Tsepka. Bye for now.